Welcome to Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and I'm joined here by my co-host, Misty Winston. And today we are pleased to welcome back Kevork Almassian. He is an independent political commentator whose work focuses on Syria. He's also the founder of the independent political commentary site Syriana Analysis, which deals with developments on the ground in Syria. Kevork, welcome back. Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you very much for inviting me again. It's a pleasure to be on your show, guys.
Sure. So I wanted to start with the recent election or elections in Syria, which saw Bashar al-Assad win a fourth term, I believe it is. Yes. And this is in the midst of the reconstruction that's been happening there after the civil war and Western proxy wars there. So can you talk a little bit about the dynamics of that election?
Actually, we have to see first of all, the elections before this election, which was in 2014, where President Assad participated in the election, vowing to defeat the CIA and MI6 and other intelligence-backed terrorist organizations. So in that stage, his political program was mostly about defeating the armed opposition that they say for Assad, including Al-Nusra Front, ISIS, Jaish al-Islam, Ahrar al-Sham, etc. And he succeeded during that period of time in eliminating at least 70% of these rebel-held areas, right? So he restored larger swath of territories with the help, of course, of the allies. And now the military aspect of the war is almost coming to an end. It's not only because the army has defeated the terrorist organizations, but also because there is an active diplomatic channels opened between different powers. Most notably is between now Russia and the United States. And there is an increasing pressure from regional countries, for example, from Jordan, from the UAE, on the United States, urging the United States to stop this regime change war or lift the sanctions on Syria, because Syria has a very strategic location, and all these countries now, they know that the regime change war has failed. So they're going to open channels back with Syria. Therefore, they are reopening their embassies in Syria, but that's not enough for them, because they're not able to do business with Syria because of the sanctions, right? Because the United States is coming after every company or any factory that wants to deal with Syria, including, of course, medical and reconstruction materials, right? So this active diplomatic activity combined with the military successes of the Syrian army has brought President Assad into a position of not giving promises, but presenting a project for the Syrians that if the previous stage was about defeating terrorism, now the second stage is to reconstruct Syria again. And what he actually said during his speech, the oath, constitutional oath speech, there were important aspects of it. One of which, Syria have now 3 strong or big industrial cities: Damascus, Homs, and Aleppo. And he said in these industrial cities, we started building 3,000 factories and 10,000 workshops, small businesses. And this will, of course, boost the Syrian economy. And he said all this work is done by Syrian hands and Syrian expertise and Syrian materials. So don't expect any help from the outside world, including the allies. Like he said it clearly, don't rely on anyone. This is our business, this is our problem, and we're gonna solve it together. And he then touched because 50% of the Syrian oil and gas energy resources and also are in the hands of the United States. And also a lot of electricity generators are working on gas. So Syrian government is incapable of providing electricity to the factories. So he said we are moving to the alternative energies, the green energy, solar systems. And we adopted this solar system experience in one of the industrial cities. and it was successful. So we're gonna generalize this experience on many factories in order to spare or what we have from the electricity to the residential areas. So he actually presented an economic project for the people. And on a political level, he said, we're not going to compromise on our territorial integrity. We're not going to compromise on the constitution. He said some people think that we need to compromise on the constitution, but the constitution is the backbone of the country. And the country needs to have one title. And he called the title by Pan-Arabism. And he said he understands that a lot of people are frustrated with Pan-Arabism because a lot of Arabic countries have betrayed Syria. But he said that doesn't mean that we have to abandon Pan-Arabism, because for us, Pan-Arabism is an economic political project which has a civilization dimension. And that doesn't mean that we're going to assimilate the minorities into the Arab identity, because we're not presenting a nationalist project. This is a civilized project for everyone. We're going to preserve all the minorities in Syria. This is our job to preserve them. And above that, we want to rely on Pan-Arabism because it's the only political, economic, and ideological alternative or project that we can rely on in having a regional integration with the regional countries, because at the end of the day, you're living in mostly Arabic area, right? So we are not going to abandon that, despite the fact that we have been stopped by many Arab countries. He also touched on the Golan Heights, and he said that they're not going to abandon any single inch of the Golan Heights. And he criticized the Arabic countries who normalized relations with Israel. And he said the modern warfare is not about occupying territories, but rather about occupying the minds. And he said Israel didn't win the war in 1948 when they occupied the Palestinian lands, but they succeeded in occupying Palestinian lands when some of the Palestinians and some of the Arabs were convinced that they can restore their rights by normalizing relations and making compromises with the Israeli occupation army. So he said our war is not only like a military warfare, but it's also a psychological warfare. And a lot of people are falling into defeatism, and they think that the only way possible for the so-called prosperity in the area is to just bow in front of Israel. And it's not only a compromise, like you're giving them humiliating compromises in exchange for nothing, right? So he drew a map full of like political, economic, strategic components, and he said, this is my project, guys. If you want to be with me, I'm with you. And my personal impression was, and I also said this on a colleague channel a few days ago on Franco Analysis, that Assad didn't abandon us when we needed him. Seriously, I'm not talking about a person who is only a politician. You know, if Assad left power, let's say in 2012, 2011, and he said, guys, I'm leaving power, I'm now too controversial for the people, for the international community, figure out how to solve this, I would have called him a traitor. If he left us in front of this tsunami of NATO regime change, war, and aggression on us, I would have called him a traitor. But he was steadfast, and he was like, ISIS was 20 kilometers away from his office, and it was very possible for him to be murdered, like Gaddafi, you know. So I owe a very big respect for Gaddafi because he stayed in his country, and it's the same thing for Assad.
And it's worth noting that Gaddafi was also a pan-Arabist, if you will, or was taking a pan-Arab approach to politics.
A lot of people don't know that Libya and Syria had a very good relations, and Gaddafi personally had a very good relations with Assad. And I would like to mention an information maybe some of the audience are not aware of. In the 80s, after in 1982, when the Muslim Brotherhood also they declared the so-called revolution against the Syrian secular government. So they were defeated. But back then, there was a very huge pressure also on the Syrian government because the brother of the former president, Hafez al-Assad, he was the one who crushed the revolution there. And when he crushed the Muslim Brotherhood uprising, the armed rebellion against the government, he felt like he's too powerful and he wanted to do a coup d'etat against Hafez al-Assad. His name was Rifat Assad. And Hafez al-Assad gave him an ultimatum that he has to leave the country. And he asked for a big amount of money back then in the 80s. Like he won't leave the country unless he has a big amount of cash. And it was Gaddafi who paid him the money and told him, please leave peacefully, go to wherever you want, just leave Syria alone, let the peace prevail there. And I even saw a photo of the current president Bashar. He was sitting on the just next to Gaddafi when he was like 5-6 years old, you know. So there were also family relationships between them, and unfortunately, Syria couldn't help Libya when the NATO started. Although I can assure you, there were multiple reports coming from Al Jazeera, which is, in my opinion, Al Jazeera is the worst media outlet in the entire Arabic world, because they don't only distort the truth, they tell blatant lies and sell it as a fact. And they said that Assad is sending his pilots to Libya in order to bomb the Libyan people. So just imagine in 2010, early 2011, when there was nothing in Syria, Jazeera was already paving the way for the Arabic street to hate Syria or Assad by saying that Assad is sending not only pilots but also warplanes in order to murder the peaceful protesters. So they really manufactured a consent, or let's say a new reality, which is based on lies, and a lot of people bought that lies, and it was a blatant lie that had nothing to do with the reality.
No, and that's a good way to say it. I often call it manufacturing reality, because that's often what a lot of our Western media outlets do as well. There's been a lot of propaganda in the West about the Syrian elections, which I find endlessly amusing, that a bunch of white people from the United States are now, experts on Syrian elections. But, can you maybe explain a little bit how Syrian elections work? How, do they have, because I mean, even though I've watched your show and I've listened to Vanessa Beeley talk, I'm always interested in talking about the election integrity of elections across the globe. Friends with Combo Couch, they're very into it, which has gotten me interested in it. But people will try to say that Assad picked his own opponents, or that people were forced to vote for him, which, if you're just like a casual observer and you see this guy walking through the streets, the people love him. He's like a beetle, you know what I mean? Like the people in Syria, and that's not to say that he's perfect, or he's some angel or a saint or whatever. He's still a world leader, and no world leaders are without their flaws and without their skeletons. But the people of Syria love him, I think, because what you said earlier, he didn't abandon them. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the election process and how that all played out.
Actually, it's in the Syrian parliament. You can nominate yourself to become a candidate, and you have to have 35 votes from the MPs of, I think, 240 MPs. You need to have only 35 votes with you. And there were, I think, around 50 candidates. And after they collect all the names of the candidates, the names of the candidates go to the higher constitutional court, and the higher constitutional court, they filter the names, and after filtering, they become 3 names. And the names of the candidates were Mr. Abdullah Saloom, and Mr. Of course, Bashar al-Assad, and Mr. Mahmoud Ahmad Mar'i. One of them was Mahmoud Ahmad Mar'i, was from the domestic opposition, who has taken part in the Geneva talks as part of the Syrian opposition delegation. So, so even the narrative or the argument that they say Assad chose the candidate, it's like he chose an opposition person who participated in the Geneva talks that is accepted by the UN and by the United States, by Britain and everyone, to be against Assad himself, right? So
I always find that really funny anyways, because in this country, Hillary Clinton did in fact choose her own opponent. And so it's,
yes.
it's one of those American exceptionalism things
I
again.
mean, one of the channels that talked about this is, of course, TYT, that we all know, that they were like, when I see the TYT, I watch their reports about the Syrian presidential elections, I'm like, I really
You're
gonna shoot
being
myself.
kind and calling them reports.
Yeah, that is pretty kind.
but I was seriously sweating. I want to shoot myself because the amount of ignorance and arrogance together is too high for me to swallow, and especially the arrogance, like, I'm not a person who like to call people he's a white or he's, but they have this arrogance in themselves that they know better what's going on in Syria, and
It's like
really
hyper Orientalism.
yes,
Yes.
exactly. And it's really irritating because, especially, I mean, Anna Kasparian, and she also hosted this other Latino woman, Francesca.
She's terrible.
Francesca, she doesn't know what is she talking about. I have a little bit I have a confession to make. I downloaded their video and I watched like frame by frame when Francesca was talking in during her presentation of the Syrian presidential election. And it's pretty obvious from her body language that she's nervous and she doesn't know what is she talking about. and she was so happy when she finished her talk, because just Anna Kasparian take the talk from me, because she doesn't know what is she talking about. And but it is sad that these people have a lot of following. Anyways, if we go back to the elections, we don't really need to independent because everyone says, not everyone, of course, the imperialists want to send like American monitors in Syria to see if there are any electoral fraud or not. There is a popular will, and this is also what President Assad talked in his last speech. Like, there is a misconception that the legitimacy of any government should be based on a liberal democratic system. That's not how things work. In Cuba, the popular participation in the decision making is much bigger than in any democratic countries. So it's not necessary. It doesn't necessarily mean if a country doesn't have a liberal democratic system that it lacks legitimacy. This is an imperialist thinking that a lot of people are infected with, and they think that it's the only way for having a prosperous and legitimate, prosperous country and a legitimate government. No, that's not how things work. And every country has the right to have its own way of ruling, right? And when you bring a recipe that belongs to the United States and apply it on Syria, it won't work. We are not Americans, and we have different experiences and we have different civilization there. So, and if you want to bring the accepted democracy of the United States into Syria, it will lead into it would most probably lead into a religious government, like it happened in Egypt. From the first time they did the fair and democratic elections, the Muslim Brotherhood came into power, right? Because it's very easy to manipulate the people into by religious slogans. This is an unfortunate thing in the entire Middle East.
Yeah,
and
we've seen it in Iraq, especially.
So why do you think it would be different in Syria if it worked that way in Iraq, when there is also differences between the religions and the sects? And even in a country like Libya, where there is like it's one colored, right? It's an all Muslim Sunni community, and still there is a big divisions because of this so-called democratic system that they forced on the people there. And look what happened to the Black Africans in Libya. They have been enslaved again, and under Gaddafi they were liberated. They were having equal rights with everyone, and now nobody talks about it. Maybe once per year you see a reportage of a BBC reporter, and it lacks complete context. They don't tell you why this happened. It's like, oh my God, because they want to show themselves like they're very humanitarians and they're covering it. But what's the context? who caused this, why happened, who destroyed Libya, who removed the leadership, and why the vacuum happened. It's they talk about the consequences without showing the reasons for or the factors that led to these consequences, right? So no, I don't agree with the American democracy. I'm sorry. I said it yesterday also on Twitter. I don't want the American democracy in Syria. It will lead into not endless internal conflicts between different components, because some components, like it's happening nowadays, the separatists from the Kurds in the eastern shores of the Euphrates, they want the oil, they want the wheat. So why would they have 50% of the oil and all the Syrian wheat, and other communities are completely deprived of it, right? So it will lead into intra fighting again if you adopt this system. I'm against this kind of democratic
to
system.
be fair, Kevork, it's not really democracy. We don't have democracy here either. It's what we call democracy is it's just a show. We just like to give you the illusion of choice, as Noam Chomsky has called it. And that's exactly, and I think that that's a really important point. I think we talked about this with Vanessa a little bit. I think Americans tend to, it is like this extreme arrogance, this American exceptionalism, where we want to put our culture and our way of doing things on other people, and other people don't live the same. We have vastly different worldviews and experiences, and we live in a different, do you know what I mean? So it's this thing where we think everybody should be like us. We want everybody to be like the United States, and that's just ridiculous.
But this is also a recipe for if people want to make a career for themselves as a journalist, it's becoming a recipe for them. Even among the so-called left in the United States, I'm seeing a lot of people in the left in the United States, and they call themselves anti-imperialists, and they're repeating the same talking points of the CIA and saying it's a brutal dictatorship, Assad has killed all his own people, and it's a police state. These are the same talking points that the CIA relied on when it launched the war on Syria. So when you call yourself an anti-imperialist and repeating the same points that the CIA is saying, just because you want to show off in front of your audience that I'm an objective, I'm not with Assad, but I'm criticizing this, say no, this is an existential war for us. You're not helping the victim. You're shooting him twice by calling the Syria as a police state, because some of these people who say it's a police state, they have been into Syria. Like, they were in Syria and they went on a journalistic visa. If it was a police state and it was a dictatorial regime, as you call it, first you wouldn't get a visa from this government, because you're calling this government a brutal dictatorship, right? So you're already receiving a visa. You're going there cruising alone, without minders, without any restrictions. But because you are a careerist, and of course I mean only this particular people, they're careerist and opportunist people. They go back and show off, like, I've been into Syria. Dude, you were in a hotel in Syria, and then you walked in some of the streets, and it's in 2021. Where have you been in the past 11 years?
Right.
When brave journalists were going to Syria, and I will mention Eva Bartlett and Vanessa Bilu, not because my colleagues, but they were under fire when they were in Syria.
For years. Yeah. And these same people who have now, taken their 3-day journey to Syria, which, listen, I'm not trashing that, like, you doing that. That's a great thing. If you're a journalist, you should absolutely, if you're going to cover Syria, you should go to Syria. So I'm not trashing that, that effort. But to then not mention the journalists who have been doing this for years before you, and then to pretend, and again, the, trying to play the neutral card. And I don't even necessarily know that it's just careerism. I think that's a big part of it. But I think people are afraid, because if you don't call Assad a brutal dictator, you get called an Assadist, and you support terrorists, and you love dictators, and you will get trashed for that. I mean, I've experienced that myself.
Anyway. They've been called anyway, just because some of them debunked the mainstream media narratives on Syria. They've been called anyway. Like, imagine that, for example, someone like Jan Henderson or the whistleblowers in the OPCW, other whistleblowers, they've been called Assadists too. There is no way to escape from these slanders, from these accusations. It's for me, it's a bullshit. They've been calling me for 12 years, like Assadist and neo-Nazi, Nazi, like everything. Like, I don't care what others call me. I know myself, And
Right.
when I'm talking to you, you're seeing my work. I'm not someone who is making a propaganda, and I'm not someone who is spreading false information or doing anything anywhere close to right wing. Like, you know what I mean? But people are too simplistic nowadays and too. Like,
Well, they rely a lot on the shock factor of what they say. So they say something like Assad is a brutal dictator who murders his own people. And that's a shocking thing to hear, especially if you're not familiar with what's been happening in Syria. And that shock overrides any context that there might be to a claim like that. So that lack of context, it makes those claims very easy to spread and believe in. And I do think careerism plays a big part in it, especially with people like Anna Kasparian, who can then go on to these cushy think tanks or whatever kind of organizations or CIA cutouts there are, and interview people like Madeleine Albright, like she's some kind of humanitarian. So there is that aspect to it, but there's also the lack of historical context too. Like Gaddafi was the first Arab leader to report Osama bin Laden to Interpol in the late 90s. Under Saddam Hussein, there was the highest intermarriage rate of Sunni and Shia in the Arab world. And also, as you were saying, with regard to going to Syria to report on the ground, after the non-chemical weapons attack in Douma in 2018, Robert Fisk filed a report where he went on the ground, he went to Douma, yes, and he was basically told, go ahead, walk around. You can look at whatever you want. You can talk to whomever you want. And he reported that when he talked to locals, some of them had no idea that there was even this story out there about a chemical attack. So it's that lack of context when you hear people like Anna Kasparian, Francesca, Cenk, when they talk about it, there's never anything that comes after the claim, like, okay, so this is how Assad is rounding up his people and murdering them. Never mind the fact that the people that Assad has been fighting against are, you know, the US's Wahhabi proxies, essentially. That's completely left out.
Yes, one of my favorite things in that video that Francesca and Anna did was when, and I watched your video on this, Kevork, and I know you were mad, but it was like good. It was like fun to watch because they were so ridiculous. But she was saying that Assad has decimated his opposition or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, they're fucking terrorists. Like, that's a good thing. Why are you trashing them for that? Like, that's cool. That's a cool thing.
The two things here is very important. Robert Fisk is a legendary reporter, and he's like a bulldog. If he saw anything close to any evidence that the Syrian government used the chemical weapons, he will spit on the face of the Syrian government and write about it right away before he even goes back to Lebanon. He's that kind of a character, you know.
Yeah, he was very outspoken against Hafez al-Assad after I believe the revolution you referred to earlier was crushed, and there was he reported on the massacre in Hama, I believe it was.
Yes, he was in Hama.
Yeah.
In the 80s, yes.
Right.
The second thing is, when you say Assad is killing his own people, I will refer this in a different way and for your audience to answer for themselves. Okay, there are a group of Syrians who joined armed groups in Syria, and their numbers are with tens of thousands, right? We shouldn't fool ourselves. There are maybe between 40 to 100,000 Syrians who joined these militant groups. And there were, of course, around between 60 to 100,000 multinational jihadists who came into Syria, and they were all fighting together against the Syrian government.
Including Chinese Uyghurs.
Chinese Uyghurs, Uzbeks. Only this week, the Chinese Uyghurs conducted a suicide attack in Western Aleppo, and the Uzbekis also conducted the suicide attack in Western Aleppo. And today I was talking to a colleague in Aleppo, and he said the Uyghurs attacked on our posts and we lost 4 soldiers, okay? So that the people know. So these so-called Syrian rebels, they are fighting alongside them. So when there is an infighting, we see it from a perspective that these guys are tools for the American imperialism, and they are tools for the regime change. So when you're killing them, they are armed. Like, it's not like you're killing your own people. They're armless people, or they're coming with you with roses or something. No, they are actual fighters fighting among tens of thousands of multinational jihadists who won't hesitate to blow up themselves just to go into paradise and have their 72 virgins. This is what they believe in. So when you're fighting them back, you're not killing your own people. You're fighting American project in Syria that is using unconventional tools this time, which is the fourth generation of asymmetrical warfare, using guerrilla warfare against the Syrian army, because Syrian army is a regular army and they don't fight guerrilla warfare. And they succeeded at the beginning until the Syrian army changed its tactics and retrained itself, etc. Right? So it's a really ridiculous thing to say is killing his own people, when some Syrians, they voluntarily wanted to be tools in the hands of the Americans. And I might excuse someone if in the beginning, 2011, 12, 13, he was misled. Okay, he thought it's a revolution. He thought that he's going to bring democracy, he's going to bring etc. etc.
Yeah,
but
I count myself among those people,
Yeah.
especially with all the fervor that was whipped up with regard to the Arab Spring.
Yes,
and it was very easy to be convinced that Assad was a brutal dictator who was killing his own people, dropping barrel bombs on them, etc.
But now, if you tell me in 2021 you still believe that these people are misled, no, these people are now knowingly mercenaries. Like, they know they're mercenaries, and we know they're mercenaries, and they get like the Free Syrian Army now, the so-called Free Syrian Army. Turkey is now, they sent them to Libya. They sent them to fight the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, and now there is a talk of sending them into Afghanistan. These are mercenaries. They're not freedom fighters, right? So when you kill a person like this, you're, despite the fact that we don't want this infighting to happen, right? We don't want anyone to die. But when you kill a person like him and you call it killing his own people, this is the most ridiculous thing I ever heard.
Yeah, that's fair, because this is, I don't want to use the word traitor, but kind of, I mean, these are people who are actively working against the benefit of the Syrian people.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that has to be dealt with. If you're the leader of Syria, you have to protect the people, and that's a threat.
To simplify it, it's like someone is breaking in your house with a gun, and it's your neighbor, and you kill him, and they call it killing his own neighbor.
Yeah.
It's like, he broke into your home with a gun. Of course, you will shoot him back, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's like self-defense is completely off the table for Assad and any Syrian people who might stand by him and his government. And that's been injected so much into the Western narrative of what's happened in Syria, is that you're not, if you do that, first of all, you're not allowed to do that. And if you do that, you're supporting a brutal dictator, and you're not trying to preserve your country, a sovereign nation, from being overrun by Western-backed terrorists. And again, we don't get any of that context from TYT, for example.
No, we get their expert who lives in Brooklyn.
Yeah, or the New Yorker or the New York Times.
I will tell you that guy, Patrick Hillsman.
Awful.
Patrick Hillsman, he has been a few times in Aleppo, and I mentioned this many times. He was sneaking into Syria, breaking into Syria without a visa, and he was passing through, coming from Turkey and passing through all the checkpoints of Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, and coming to Syria. And he never mentions that there is Al-Qaeda in Aleppo. He never mentions 13,000 civilians were murdered by the so-called rebels, by their mortars. And he never mentions the kidnappings. He never mentions the siege on the Western Aleppo. He never mentions anything of this. He's just there to make a propaganda. And today I was reading another tweet by a person who claims, of course, that Patrick Hillsman is the grandson of a former. Okay, I will get it just right now.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, but yeah, he's like got connection. Shady. He's a shady character.
So Patrick Hillsman just so happens to be the grandson of the State Department official who led a coup against Diem, was the architect of the concentration camp program, and the irony is he backed the chemical weapons campaign against Vietnam. So this guy, this guy is very fishy, and we have to ask questions. How is this? How he came to Turkey? Who paid for his trips? And how he was allowed to come into Syria, because you need to have connections in Turkey as well to cross the border. And then he was embedded with Al-Qaeda there, and they're using him as an expert on Syria.
Yeah, I want to know why TYT chose him as an expert. Out of all of the people that there are to talk to have on their show as an expert on Syria, to have a guy who's written all of 4 paragraphs on Syria is suspicious to me. Why are you doing that? Why are you having some guy who lives in Brooklyn, and then they promote him as this expert, this he's a Syrian-based journalist, and within the first 30 seconds, he had to her own guest had to correct her and be like, no, I'm not in Syria.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And it's very suspicious to me that this guy, who clearly has no qualifications to be talking about this subject, is the person that TYT, with all of their money, chose to have on their show. There are lots of people who they could have chose.
He is a troll. Let's call it the way he is. Patrick Hillsman is a troll, and he trolled me a lot in the past when he was in Aleppo. And it shows that the TYT, they never do their homework. If they checked him, they would have found who is this guy. And secondly, I mean, there are many experts on Syria that they can host, but they have to also defend themselves, because they found themselves in a position of defense from their perspective that everyone was criticizing. Just go and watch their videos about Syria, the 2 videos that they made about the elections. The thumbs down are hilarious. It's 2,000 thumbs down in actually 200 thumbs up, So they know they are in deep shit. So they brought this guy, and Anna Kasparian, the day before the interview, she I believe she wrote on Twitter that she will host a Syrian journalist. And yes, so the first time was a Syrian journalist, and then during the show she said he is based in Syria, and he was like, no, dude, I'm in Brooklyn. Calm down. And I've never been based in Syria. It was like coming and visiting Syria. So
Brooklyn, Syria, what's the difference?
10,000 kilometers.
maybe he was at a CIA base a few times in Syria.
Maybe
that's about it as far as
I would never rule out that possibility, because why would what kind of motivation should someone have to travel all the way 10,000 kilometers to Syria and stay with Al-Qaeda terrorists for days, and they don't touch him, and he's living without electricity, under fire? And what's his mission? Maybe we will never find these answers, but I'm not a conspiratory person, but we need to ask questions. So what was his mission if he wasn't making any reportage? He doesn't have any actual writings about Syria, right? Or investigation about what happened in Eastern Aleppo. So what was he doing there? Would you like to go sit in Eastern Aleppo for days under fire without basic necessities, just to sit? No. You have to do something, right? You have to collect information at the end of the day. So,
and you're right. Who funded that? I want to know who funded that, because, it's not a cheap thing to fly to Turkey and then, spend time in Syria and all of that stuff. So I want to know who paid for that.
And he is of course paying every checkpoint too. If you want to pass the checkpoints and go to Aleppo, it's 110 kilometers, and there are tens of checkpoints there, and all these terrorists are there, and you have to bribe them all the time to reach to Aleppo. Maybe he had also connections with what was his name? Also, he's an African journalist in Idlib, Abdel. I forgot. He says that the CIA tried to drone him a few times, and he escaped. And he was recently also detained by Al-Qaeda in Syria. American journalist in I don't have a keyboard working here now, but so there is an American journalist also now in Idlib, and he was detained recently by HTS, and they released him recently because of photos that was leaked to the social media of him naked, sending naked photos of him to some woman in Idlib. So they detained him and now released him. And this guy was also in Aleppo back then. And
is it Abdul Karim?
Yes, Abdul Karim. So Abdul Karim was in Aleppo as well, and he was bused in 2016 to Idlib. and he was used by CNN many times as an independent filmmaker and a journalist in Aleppo, while all his interviews and all his shows are he's sitting with notorious Al-Qaeda leaders, the longest beard you can ever see in your life, with and he was giving them platform, and the entire narrative that he promotes is that this is an Islamic revolution against an infidel tyrant. So, and the CNN used him many times. The Sky News used him as their fixer in Idlib. So these guys are in Syria not only to do some journalism. Of course, they have ties with intelligence agencies, and they collect information, factual information underground, especially about the situation in rebel-held areas. Because, as we know, the US and UK, they sent hundreds of millions of dollars into these areas, right? Only yesterday, the declassified website revealed that the UK has spent over $400 million in opposition-held areas only in between 2014 and 2017. $400 million from the taxpayer money of the Brits. And the documents prove, this is a mainstream media, not even an alternative media, that a lot of this money has gone to radical jihadists in Syria for them to buy their Toyotas, to buy their cell phones, to buy weaponry, etc. Because it's a very, very, very complicated plot against Syria. What the Americans did, basically, they sent weapons to the so-called moderate rebels from the Free Syrian Army. At the same time, they enable ISIS and al-Nusra to have some sort of a financial independence by controlling the gas fields, for example. So Turkey buys the gas and the oil of Syria from ISIS, or used to buy them from ISIS. And ISIS uses this money to buy weapons from the Free Syrian Army. So it's a complete circus of, it's a mafia game, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And America knows who was buying their weapon. I mean, you can see clearly American weaponry in the hands of the ISIS, right? And they say, oh no, these weapons were stolen from the Iraqi bases in Iraq. So we didn't give any weapons to ISIS. It's a crap. We know how things work in Syria, and we know how the United States, they wanted to use ISIS. Of course, I'm not saying they directly founded ISIS, but they saw the growth of ISIS. They allowed it to grow, this Frankenstein, and they wanted to use this Frankenstein against Assad to force him to compromise, and it didn't work. It didn't work, and thankfully the allies of Syria have intervened at the right time.
So, all that being said, there's still fighting taking place in Syria, or hostilities, if you want to water it down to that. And they're mostly, at least recently, coming from Israel. We saw in the past day or so, Israel bombed Homs, which is near the Lebanese border, and it's been using as an excuse what it always uses as an excuse, Hezbollah and the ever vague Iranian-backed militias. Can you talk about that a little bit? And also the importance to Syria of the occupied Golan Heights, which Israel has illegally occupied since 1973.
Actually, I have to mention two things. First, Israel bombed Syria last week or the past 2 days twice, once in Aleppo and once in Homs. And these both cities are at least like 400, Homs is like 400 kilometers away from the first contact line with Israel, and Aleppo is like 800 kilometers away from the first contact line with Israel, right? So there is no imminent threat by anyone against Israel from there, if there is any, right? If Israel wants to complain about anything, maybe from their perspective, they should complain if there is any activity in the Golan Heights or on the contact line in Al Quneitra area. And if they bomb Damascus, they could say, oh, weapons arrived from Iran in Damascus airport, so we have to bomb them. I'm talking as from their perspective. But when you want to bomb in Homs and you want to bomb research center in Homs, and this is a military research center, okay, it's for Syrian army, it's not even for Iran. And when you bomb in Aleppo, also another airport, who died from this in these airstrikes? Syrian army soldiers. So if they're really striking, let's say, Hezbollah fighters or Iran-backed militias, where are they? Why aren't they dying? Why only SAA, Syrian Army soldiers, are dying in this airstrike? So nobody can deny that there are Iranian advisors in Syria. And now in 2021, the number of Hezbollah fighters are below 5,000, okay? And they're mostly, so there are areas that are recently liberated. They have checkpoints there. Some of them are in Al-Badia against ISIS. There is no active Hezbollah force in Syria who is aiming to fight Israel. If they want to fight Israel, they can fight it from Lebanon, and it's they are well equipped there, and they have their trenches, and they have city under a city. If you go to southern Lebanon, you can see like they have built a city under a city in southern Lebanon. So the battlefield for Hezbollah against Israel is there, not in Syria. But Israel, I would say there is a good Twitter account. It's called Sam 2.0. He follows, monitors the Israeli spy plane the entire week, and he sees their activity, what are they doing, and he predicts when Israel is going to strike. So basically what Israel does is they monitor the cargoes coming from Iran. Of course, there are weaponry also coming from Iran through these cargoes, and we are using this weaponry against the terrorist organizations, right? And they follow them all the way. Where are they going? Whether to Homs, whether to Aleppo, and they try to hit these cargoes, right? And every time, like you hit a cargo, for example, what's the strategic benefit of hitting a cargo? You're not reaching anything. Like you're not having any upper hand by hitting a cargo. And basically, I would guarantee you, if they are firing 10 missiles, 8 of them are being destroyed at before reaching to the destination. So if you shoot 10 missiles, you're hitting 2, you may be destroying 1 or 2 cargoes, but the rest are reaching their destination. And this weaponry are being stored in their safe places. So Israel doesn't want Syria to restore its strength, not because Syria is going to attack Israel. There is no plan, there is no intention to attack Israel from Syria at all. Syria is a very, like, it's a exhausted country right now. Their priority is to reconstruct, but Israel knows when Syria reconstructs or re-empowers its army too, Syria will have also a stronger stance in negotiations in the future. Because if you go to negotiations and you are from a weak stance, why would the stronger side negotiate with you, right? So speaking of the Golan Heights, in my opinion, it's very, very difficult right now to liberate the Golan Heights in these circumstances. Unfortunately, I'm saying this with all objectivity. The priority is now to liberate Idlib. And for that, the Russian Air Force this week was active over Idlib, because 2 weeks ago, there was the UN Security Council voting on allowing border crossing humanitarian aid from Western countries into the rebel-held areas. And the Russians were willing to give that green light to the Americans, but Assad had his own reservations, and they said, we need compromises from the United States. Why would we just allow them to have a easy pass for this? They can send us this aid, and we can distribute it even into rebel-held areas. The Americans refused. So when they were during the negotiations, the agreement is, it seems that the Americans will send aid through for 6 months more, in exchange for promises to practice pressure on Turkey, and for Turkey to practice pressure on the terrorist groups in Idlib to have a disarmament area between 6 to 10 kilometers on both sides of the M4 highway. That the Syrian government really needs that highway to connect Aleppo into the coastal area, Latakia, Tartus, Jeble, etc. So the M4 is very important for Syria, and all these developments that is happening now in the area the diplomatic activity, the military activity over Idlib is to reopen the M4. And to do that, you have to push back these terrorists between 6 to 10 kilometers on the both sides of the M4. But after that, God knows what's next, because the Russians want the Idlib file to be solved in a diplomatic way. But at the end of the day, if it fails, there have to be other solutions on the table, right? So also the Chinese might have a leverage, because they need to also, I mean, collect their garbage. I mean, we have over 5,000 Uyghurs fighters. These are very well-armed and well-trained fighters. And we have over 15,000 family members of the Uyghurs. And you have to know, all the young boys from age 7, they go to training camps. So they are unfortunately the future terrorists. And these kids are just innocent kids. But when you are born in such an environment and you're trained like that, I mean, we have seen kids, 7, 8 years old kids are decapitating Syrian army soldiers during this war. So it's really unfortunate.
We talked a little bit earlier about Al Jazeera and the abysmal source it's become. And one of the items that recently came up on Al Jazeera with regard to Syria is, the headline is something like, Syria must come clean about mass disappearances that are still occurring in Syria. And the intimation there is that the Assad government is disappearing people. Do you have any knowledge of that? Can you speak to that at all? On the surface, it seems like more propaganda, and probably is, but I'm wondering if you can add any context to that. And also talk a little bit about, as we wrap up, what the sanctions are doing to ordinary Syrians with regard to bread prices and gas prices.
Actually, the forced disappearance is one of the, I don't have much like knowledge about it, but I know that a lot of human rights organizations are talking about that people were disappeared. I will mention something. In 2000 and between 2012, 13, 14, when there was a chaos and the government was losing territory very fast, it became like a jungle. A lot of people disappeared. I have friends who were my schoolmates. They disappeared in between 2012 and 2014. And they're Syrian-Armenian Christians. And until today, we don't know anything about them. And I think they died somehow. I don't know what happened, but while you're traveling on the highway, because everyone had guns, okay? But unfortunately, the opposition, they are very good in their lobbying campaigns. And they want you to believe that all these people who disappeared are now in jails. Like they talk about like over 100,000 people who disappeared in Syria, and they say they are in Syrian jails. They like, even if you want to put them in jail, there is no capacity for 100,000 people to put them in jails. And one prominent example of the forced disappearance is Razan Zaytouni. Razan Zaytouni is a prominent woman activist. She's an activist, political activist who calls for human rights, democracy in Syria, even before the war. And we all knew about her. And I believe in 2012 or 13, she disappeared. And the entire media, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the United States, everyone is talking like Assad regime abducted her and she disappeared and maybe she is dead. And the truth of the matter is, also I blame the Syrian government, because the Syrian government is like a dinosaur. In dealing with the media, they are not flexible. They can't defend themselves and they can't show facts. They're like a very old person who is like, before they talk, I could make 10 videos about the issue, right? They're really, 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 really like not professional in this. So until like we had an information from Eastern Ghouta that activists like me, we received information that she's abducted by Jaish al-Islam. And when I wrote about it a few years ago, I was called like a monster. Like I was called like I'm a apologist for mass extinction and for forced disappearance, etc. These were just the information that came from Irsun Ghouta that I'm presenting to you. And a few days ago, Deutsche Welle, the German public television that is funded by the German government, they finally admitted that Razan Zaytouni was abducted by Jaish al-Islam and they executed her in Eastern Ghouta. She was a prominent activist, but because she is not an Islamist, because she's a left-wing secularist and she was anti-Assad, but even that she's an anti-Assad, it didn't help her with this Jaish al-Islam and all these terrorist groups. So just imagine if these groups came to power, what would have done to the people who are pro-Assad? If they killed their own, like people who also hate Assad and they want him to go, and they killed her, they executed her. And there are mass graves that we find every day in Syria, and we don't know who killed who.
Right.
We don't know who are these people. You have to do their DNA test, etc., and you give the bodies then to the families. But we don't know who killed them. We have no evidence. We just see, for example, a bullet, something in their head, and it's a very, very sad situation. And I'm not really claiming at all that the Syrian, for example, prison system is like in Switzerland. Not at all. There are many things that need to be reformed in Syria. And I want to mention you something. In 2008 and 2009, Syria hired a European EU agency to train the police in Syria in how to deal in such situations. So they wanted to reform even the police apparatus in Syria. This was just before the war, a year before the war. So if anyone has an evidence, and this is a word, if anyone has an evidence that there is someone forced disappeared in Syrian government prisons, I'm the first one who will post about it, and I'm the first one who will say freedom for this person. If there is no court, nothing, like he's staying in jail, for example, I will be the first one to defend him, even though maybe that person wants me dead. I don't care, but I don't agree if I'm with the Syrian government, and if there was forced disappearance, I'm totally against it, of course.
So looking to the future, I asked you a few minutes ago about what the sanctions are doing to quote unquote ordinary Syrians, as they're often referred to, but the Syrian people. Gas prices are through the roof. Bread prices are through the roof. Staples of living are just at exorbitant costs.
Medicine, milk, everything.
Right, and this largely has to do with the Caesar sanctions, which are of very dubious provenance. That's a whole other conversation. But based on your analysis, your research, your sources, and I'm not asking you to make a solid prediction here, but what is your sense of what Syria faces, at least in the near future?
At the current moment, the situation is worse than what it has been during the days of the war. Like when ISIS was occupying 70% of Syria, the situation was even better on the currency level, on the bread, electricity, fuel, gas, milk, etc. Right now, the situation is it's unimaginable. Like, and the people, like, you need at least as a person 500,000 Syrian lira per person to survive, just to eat and drink and sleep. That's it. And the salaries are like 100,000. So you do the calculations. It's horrible. I can't even tell you more than that. But I'm a little bit optimistic after the recent deal between Russia and the United States about this border crossing checkpoint. And there are tacit agreements that I've been informed that there are things that are not declared. and the United States, although is imposing harsh sanctions on Syria, but they have open channels for Syria to circumvent these sanctions. And if the Syrian government lets this aid to go to the rebel-held areas. So also the Chinese came to Syria on the same day President took his oath. So they also signed on 6 agreements with Syria. And Assad also declared the construction of 3,000 factories and, as I mentioned, 10,000 workshops. So all these factors will definitely have a positive impact on Syria. But there is also a very important thing that a lot of people do not mention it, which is Lebanon. Lebanon is it's like a pain in the ass for Syria right now, because we have, according to estimates, local estimates, between 40 to 60 million million dollars in the Lebanese banks, and this money is being frozen by the Lebanese banks because there was a complete collapse of the banking system there. So even if you have a money, the bank is not giving you any penny. Just they tell you go and do whatever you want. They don't give you any money. So the Syrian pound was like between 1,000. So every Syrian lira, every dollar was like 50 Syrian liras before the war. $1, 50 Syrian liras. And this has increased dramatically during the war, but it was more or less steady till 2018. It was like 1,800 lira per dollar. And all of a sudden, in 2 years, it crumbled like to 3,000. It's now, every dollar is 3,000 liras, because we had some solid money in Lebanon and we were able to bring some dollars from there. And because of the also American backed uprising there, the entire banking system collapsed in Lebanon and nobody can take their money. And even Assad mentioned this. So I said, we have money there, but we can't touch them. And the Central Bank of Syria is under sanctions. So you can't really do transactions, you can't really do business, you can't do anything. And Syria has no solid currency. We don't have euros, we don't have dollars, we have nothing left in Syria. We're just living day by day. And we are getting fuel from Iran. Like if there are 2 tankers coming into Syria, I will mention this because it's very important. People think that if 4 million barrels of crude oil arrives to Syria, oh, that will be enough for us for many months. No, the crude oil, you can't use it. You have to refine it. Mm-hmm. And when you refine it, it will be like maybe half the amount. And you also you have to make it, some of it benzene, some of it fuel, etc. And this amount of 4 million barrels is enough for like 40 days in Syria. So every 40 days, you need like 2 tankers, like another 4 million of crude oil coming to Syria. And don't forget that Israel is like, they are hitting the Iranian tankers too. They already sank a few of them on their way to Syria. So it's a really horrible situation. How can you secure these needs? Like your gas and oil fields are occupied by the United States. Iran is sending you oil, but Israel is there, is gonna sink your tankers. So, I mean, a lot of my friends in Syria are like, enough is enough. We're fed up. The government is shit, la la la, you know. But I know for sure, like the government can't do anything. They don't have it. Like, how can you give them this glass of water if you don't have a water in it? You don't have it. You can't give your people things that you don't have, including milk. Even the milk is coming from outside of Syria. It's 2020, 2021 economically is the worst phase of the Syrian war, also because of the Trump's draconian sanctions. The Caesar Act is very bad. It targets, like, if today I'm Kevork. If I send, let's say, a few tankers of products to Syria for reconstruction, for basic necessities, the opposition here, they will send my name to the US State Department and I will be listed on the sanctions list. So no one can do business with Syria. So how can these people survive? It's like an open air prison for them, right? And but they're doing this for they're helping the Syrian people, like they're helping
humanitarian
the Cuban
efforts.
they're helping the Cuban people now.
Right. Yes. We like to help. We're helpers, Kevork. I don't know if you know that, but us Americans we're big helpers.
Yeah, and I think bringing up Cuba is important because there is a line that connects all of these conflicts, for lack of a better word, and that line is Western
conquests, maybe better.
Western imperialism. And the contradiction of the West saying we want to see a stable democratic Syria, and then doing everything it can to undermine Syria's ability to do that. I mean, it's so glaring, and it doesn't even take scratching below the surface to see that, if you're going to be honest and objective with yourself. But as we talked about earlier, there are people who don't want to do that for a complex of reasons, and I think it's safe to say that they're complicit in what's happening in Syria and the suffering that's happening there.
But we always blame the United States. Yes, of course, the United States has a big role, but also, if there were it not for some Syrians who are lobbying now in the United States with the Zionist AIPAC to impose harsher sanctions, these sanctions won't see light. They are working day and night, and like some of the Cuban community in the United States. Like I posted about this the other day. I said, when I was a kid, my father used to brag about ancient Arabic quotes, and one of which is, even a donkey doesn't fall in the same hole twice. It's like, why would you believe the United States want to bring you any good in Cuba right now, right?
Yeah.
Or anywhere. If you are anywhere, the United States is not going to help. That's not what we do. We destroy. That's an unfortunate fact. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. But thanks for coming on and talking about this, because like we mentioned earlier in the show, there is a shit ton of propaganda about Syria in Western media. And like we said, even within independent circles, people are not being honest. They're not being honest with their audiences. They're, pushing these State Department propaganda points. And it's really unfortunate because a lot of these people, I don't think, are doing bad work. On the whole, I think that they have this kind of ingrained imperialism and this ingrained need to like self-protect against, the smears and the slander, and they want to protect their careers and all of that stuff, which is sad. So I'm really appreciative to you for coming on to talk about what's actually happening in Syria. I think if you want to know what's happening in Syria, you should talk to people who are from Syria or who live in Syria, or I think that's probably just a good way to go for it.
That's sort of basic things, guys. Just talk.
Do you want to tell everybody where they can follow you on social media and stuff, where they can find Syriana Analysis? Because I love your work. I watch it all the time. Let people know where they can find it.
Actually, most of the videos I'm posting are Syriana Analysis YouTube channel, and tomorrow I will post an important video about the UK's funding of the terrorist groups in Syria, and in collaboration with Vanessa Billy. And my Twitter account is Kevork Almassian. Also everything, like I'm all the platforms with the names of either Kevork Almassian or Syriana Analysis, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I'm not yet on other Vovkin. I applied, but waiting for a confirmation. Inshallah, let's say.
Yeah. Well, I nominate you and fully support your joining the Rockfin family.
I will.
Yes. So yeah.
Hopefully we'll see that happen. Quickly.
Cool. So everybody follow Kevork's work. It's amazing. I can't wait for your video with Vanessa. I love Vanessa, so that'll be awesome. She does great work as well, and Eva too, Eva Bartlett. So thanks for coming on again. We really appreciate it, and we will catch everybody next time.
Thanks, Kevork.
Ciao. Bye-bye.